Intently to the opening remarks of my colleague, and he seems to try to justify the passage of the REINS Act, which I rise in opposition to, by the way, seems to justify that by saying that it has been the job-killing regulations of the Obama administration that has our economy in its position, which is one that is not good. And despite trying to convince the American people of that fact or of that allegation, the American people are aware of the facts. They are aware of the fact that 8 years ago, when President Obama came into office, this economy, under Republican stewardship, using trickle-down economics as its model, our economy 8 years ago, as President Obama took office, neared the Great Depression. In fact, we call it the period of the Great Recession. This country almost went into depression, and it went into a Great Recession because of the policies of George Bush and the Republicans, trickle-down economics, which Daddy Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, once referred to as voodoo economics, and he was right about that. Let's look at where we were then and look at where we are now and ask ourselves, are we not better off now than we were then? There's not many voices that could say, no, we're not better off now than we were then, because they know that since then there have been 81 straight months of positive private sector job growth. They know that over 15.6 million new jobs have been added to our economy. President Obama. They also know that 30 million more people have health insurance and access to the health care system now than they did back then. They know that regulations had to ensue from passage of the Affordable Care Act to enable those 30 million people to have coverage now. And that's why they want to introduce this legislation to cut regulations. They want to try to hurt the Affordable Care Act. They also know that regulations had to spring forth from the Dodd-Frank Wall Street regulation legislation that was passed in this body. They know that those regulations have protected the finances and the financial security of Americans, who are doing far better now than they were 8 years ago as President Obama took office. American people know that they're much better off now. They know that bankruptcies have gone down. They know that foreclosures have gone down. They know that they have a better job. They know that things are better now than they were back then. But the Republicans, you'll remember, and the American people remember, the very day of President Obama's first inauguration, when Mitch McConnell and a cabal of Republicans, both House and Senate, met crying in their beers at a Capitol Hill bar on the night of the inauguration, and they imparted on a strategy to do what? To make sure that President Obama would be a first-term president. And so they resolved to oppose everything that he proposed. And they certainly did. But despite unprecedented opposition from the Republicans, just saying no to everything, the American people know that they're in a better position today than they were this time 8 years ago, coming into the Obama administration. So they want to introduce legislation to do away with the rules and the regulations concerning the Affordable Care Act and the Dodd-Frank legislation, which has protected the financial security of Americans over the last 8 years. That's why they come forward with this so-called jobs bill, this regulatory reform bill called the REINS Act. Going to produce or create one single job, but what it will do is cut the health, safety, and well-being measures. It will cut measures to protect the health, safety, and well-being of Americans. This misguided legislation would amend the Congressional Review Act to require that both houses of Congress pass and the President sign a joint resolution of approval within 70 legislative days before any major rule issued by an agency can take effect. In other words, this bill would subject new major rules to nullification by Congress through an unconstitutional legislative veto by one chamber of commerce. Following Republican attempts earlier this week to gut ethics and oversight rules that are necessary to police corruption, it is telling that the REINS Act is the next bill that the House would consider in the 115th Congress. Americans should understand what the game plan is of the Republicans. They want the fox to guard the hen house. That's why the very first act that they tried to get passed was reform of the House ethics regime. They wanted to neuter it, place it under the control of the Republican-controlled House Ethics Committee, where it would then languish and die like a prune on a vine that was unwatered. That's the first thing they came up with. And the American people called them on it and wouldn't let them get past it, wouldn't let them pass it, so they have postponed it. America, you need to keep your eyes on this Congress to make sure that they don't follow through with that measure that would install the foxes over the hen house. And what they want to do is install the corporate foxes over America's hen house with this REINS Act. The REINS Act is central to the Speaker's so-called better way agenda, which is really only a better way for rich corporate elites to further insulate themselves from public accountability, and is emblematic of the same tired and crony capitalist proposals that have been kicked around by opponents of environmental and public health protections since the 1980s. In fact, in 1983, Chief Justice John Roberts, who was then a counsel to President Reagan, criticized a similar proposal as unwise because it would hobble agency rulemaking by requiring affirmative congressional assent to all major rules and would seem to impose excessive burdens on the regulatory agencies. In addition to being an unmitigated disaster for public health and safety, proposals like the REINS Act will actually do major harm to regulatory reform attempts, as the late Justice Antonin Scalia wrote in 1981. Then a professor at University of Chicago Law School, Justice Scalia cautioned, quote, "Those in the Congress seem perversely unaware that the accursed unelected officials downtown are now their unelected officials, presumably seeking to move things in their desired direction, and that every curtailment of desirable agency discretion obstructs, principally, departure from Democrat-produced pro-regulatory status quo." Now, it's not often that I quote Justice Scalia, but ironically, I do so. The REINS Act also imposes deadlines for the enactment of a joint resolution approving a major rule that could charitably be referred to as Byzantine, but so as not to use too lofty a language, I'll just declare that this thing is like throwing a monkey wrench in a well-oiled